One of our oldest and most popular videos talks about the GTX 960 4GB versus GTX 960 2GB cards and the value of choosing one over the other. The discussion continues today, but it's more focused on 3GB versus 6GB comparisons or 4GB versus 8GB comparisons. Now, looking back at 2015's GTX 960, we are revisiting with locked frequencies to compare memory capacities and how it's aged. The goal is to look at both frame rate and image quality to determine how well the 2GB card has aged versus how well the 4GB 960 has aged. Before that, this video is brought to you by MSI's RTX 2070 Gaming Z 8GB card. The RTX 2070 Gaming Z uses MSI's dual fan design with large blades, which we've previously tested to have among the best noise-normalized thermal results in the class. MSI's 2070 Gaming Z has a fat heatsink, furthering the focus on reduced noise levels by allowing the fans to spin slower. RGB LEDs naturally are abundant on the card, but can be blacked out to match the carbon and blackout shroud. Learn more at the link in the description below. First of all, a lot of things have changed since that content. Number one, we've changed a lot. Our testing methodology has improved further in the obvious 4 years since then. So that's a topic on its own, where results today will be different from results 4 years ago. Further, the environment has changed. Windows 10 has changed significantly. I think we were using 10 we probably used 10 at the time. I don't know, whatever was out. I don't know if it's 7 or 10 at this point, or 8 maybe. It might have been 8. But either way, the OS has changed significantly, and also drivers have changed, things like that. So we haven't normalized for those variables. We're not doing now versus then. What we're doing is now. So 2GB versus 4GB today, and we've done a few more steps here than we might have in years past to further improve the accuracy of the data. And one of those is to equalize these in frequency. Fortunately, because of the 900 series, this is pretty easy to do. It's Boost 2.0. It's before NVIDIA really started pushing the thermal dependent frequency that we see in modern architectures. And so it's easy to lock the two to the same exact frequency down to megahertz, one of them, and same memory frequency as well. So everything's identical here. The cooling was maxed out on both cards, but it's irrelevant because Boost doesn't behave the way it does today. And that allows us to get a strict A-B comparison between 4 and 2GB, even though it's two different cards, they're clocked the same. So it actually doesn't matter that they have a different heatsink and fan. So locked frequency is a big step for ensuring the data is accurate. Another thing that we need to talk about is memory used versus memory allocated or requested. A lot of people talk about how much memory is being used by an application when they open GPU-Z or Task Manager or an on-screen display. And what that is showing you is how much memory the application has requested. And that doesn't mean what's actually engaged or what's actually needed to run the program. So some applications might see 11 gigabytes on a card and request all 11 gigabytes. But in reality, they might only be using 4. And so you really can't rely on that number to mean anything. It doesn't practically tell us anything. We have to do image quality tests and frame rate tests or frame time tests to see if there's any difference in the memory capacities. It's not enough to just look at how much is used by a game, because a lot of them will request more than they actually need actively. And finally, as we get into the results here, an important thing to think about and remember is that as we do things like increase the resolution, increase the texture quality, we will definitely exceed the 2GB limit of this card, especially when we're using modern titles. So, because of that, we are going to see differences in performance as it becomes limited in memory. Again, especially with modern titles. But when we're looking at a game running at 26 FPS versus 30, although that is percentage-wise a significant change, in terms of playability, it doesn't matter. You're not really going to be happy with either experience. So that's something to think about as well, is even though we can see academically what the differences are between the cards if we force it, you still have to question practically whether it matters to you in real life. Anyway, let's get into the testing. We'll start with Sniper Elite 4. Sniper Elite 4 is the absolute best example to start with, and it's because the FPS numbers completely betray what's happening on the screen. If we look at our GPU bench, the chart starts at 1080p for this one in Sniper Elite 4, you'll see that the GTX 960 Strix 2GB card actually posts a 57 FPS average with the lows well spaced at 41 FPS and 39 FPS. Comparatively, the 960 SSC 4GB card is within margin of error at 58 FPS average. Lows are also within our wider error margins of the smaller datasets for 1% lows. As a frame rate, it looks like there's no difference, and that the 4GB card might actually be, quote, overkill, as you could postulate that the rest of the GPU might not be keeping up enough for the memory capacity to ever matter. In reality, we need an image quality comparison, and this is a newer game that treats GPUs a bit differently than games did in 2015. All games will handle this their own way, but Sniper Elite 4 handles VRAM limitations by just silently, although obviously, tanking texture resolution and quality to compensate for overextension on VRAM consumption. Let's start by looking at 4K, just to really exaggerate this effect. It's immediately visible, even without the side-by-side comparison, that there are big differences in image quality, again, especially at 4K, where we're just stressing the card so much, and it's prioritizing running at that resolution rather than running the image where we want it. So we have issues with shadows, we have issues with mesh quality, with texture quality, everything is worse. And that is something that doesn't show up in FPS data, and as such, FPS data is invalid for showing this comparison. This happens at 1080p too, it's to a lesser degree, and it does take a few minutes to really start to take away that texture quality, because it takes a little bit of time for the memory to reach capacity, for the game to start exceeding the memory's capacity. And so we see issues with image quality at both 1080 and 4K, with 1080 being more relevant. It's just that 4K is more obvious and it happens immediately. But either way, this does invalidate the frame rate numbers because, well, they don't mean anything if the image being rendered changes. It's no longer a controlled scenario, but it does illustrate the issue with running 2 GB on a 960 in the modern era. Apex Legends at 1080p positions the 960 SSC 4GB at 42 FPS average when clock matched with the Strix 2GB card, running lows in the range of 30 FPS. Note that we could improve performance with lowered settings, clearly, but the goal is more to focus on the head-to-head comparison, not to make it playable. The 4GB card leads outside of margin of error, claiming a 10% gain over the 2GB card. GTA 5 was released after the 960s launched by just a few months, so it's the closest to launch comparison. At 1080p, the 962GB card ends up at 50 FPS average and is well within error margins when compared to the 960 SSC. These are about as close as you can get. At 1440p, we see the same results. The two cards are within margin of error of each other, and so we can declare that they are functionally the same in this test. At least that's true with regard to performance. Image quality also doesn't show much of a change. So unlike Sniper Elite 4, we see here that the image quality has the same texture quality. We see that the mesh quality is about the same. Everything's the same. So this is all logical. If we saw massive changes in the image quality, we would also expect the frame rate to go up on the card that is reducing the image quality. F1 2018 at 1080p positions the 960 SSC 4GB card at 45 FPS average when frequency locked, with lows at 28 FPS and 16 FPS 1% and 0.1%. The 960 Strix 2GB card did end up about at 42 FPS average, enabling the 4GB card a lead of 8.2%. This difference is outside of our run-to-run error. We did have one test pass that had an excursion from the mean, but even if we eliminate that single test pass, the lead of the 4GB card remains at 5.5% and is outside of error margins. At 1440p, our existence of the stock 960 SSC and the clock-locked one helps illustrate that the test results are outside of error once again, as these two devices represent different test settings, run at different times, and still advantaged by the extra memory. The test range is plus or minus 0.5 FPS average in this test for these cards. The Strix 960 2GB card hits 29.6 FPS average, permitting the clock-locked 960 SSC at 1442 MHz a lead of about 16% at 1440p. This is a substantial lead, and although 1440p isn't a particularly good experience with either of these cards, the important part is that it stresses VRAM and shows us the limitations. These are further illustrated with the significantly lower 1% and 0.1% lows on the 2GB card, demonstrating frame time variance and inconsistency. Even at 1440p, F1 2018 image quality remains the same between the 2GB and 4GB devices. We drop performance from swapping in and out of video memory more aggressively, but we don't seem to have a reduction in image quality. Far Cry 5 at 1080p doesn't illustrate differences of any major margin. We're at 44 FPS average for the 960 4GB variants, with the Strix 962GB card at 42.1 FPS average. These are nearing error for this title, although the range technically does exit it just barely. At 1440p, the differences emerge with greater resolution. The 964GB cards maintain a lead of about 11%, since each frame at this rate is meaningful, and the 0.1% lows also show some gains on the 4GB card. Far Cry 5 also doesn't suffer an image quality reduction, which is largely demonstrated by the frame rate difference in performance. We'd likely see an image quality reduction accompanied with a frame rate increase, which is not observed here. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p places the frequency locked 960 at 36.7 FPS average, allowing it a lead of about 14%. Every single test pass for the 964GB was between 36.6 and 36.8 FPS average, marking this benchmark as highly reliable and with minimal variance. The 960 Strix demonstrated more variance, with results between 31.7 and 33.1 FPS average. 1440p again shows the same scaling that we've seen before, with the 4GB card pulling ahead in a measurable way, but again, we're at a point where you wouldn't be playing on either card anyway. It's still important to show the difference, just not particularly meaningful to the user experience. Shadow of the Tomb Raider's image quality also looks the same between the two. Some characters randomly generate, but looking at floor tiles, we see the same texture quality and resolution. The same is true for Lara Croft, who has the same texture and mesh quality in each scene, and the tree and the pole behind her also have the same image quality. So, as always, with this type of thing, the answer is, well, it sort of depends. On average, the 4GB card is definitely better. And we do have a serious issue in Sniper Elite 4 where the game treats this exceeding of the memory capacity by lowering the quality of the visuals you've set. So your quality settings actually mean nothing at that point. And clearly the 4GB card today is doing better. Now, the 4GB card in 2015 versus the 2GB card in 2015, we tested at the time, and it really, again, it depended on the title, but the differences are not always present, but they are sometimes present, which is annoying as a conclusion, because it really just means that you would have had to look at the types of games you're playing at the time versus what was tested online and see if it mattered to you. But just like today, where we look at 4 versus 8, and we say, well, yeah, 8's better on a 2080 than 4 would be, it's going to come down to the GPU that's accompanied with the memory. And to some extent, when you actually play with these things at reasonable settings, they're really not all that different. The differences start to emerge once you start beating them up so hard with texture resolution, with screen resolution, with the mesh quality, things like that, that the memory is finally becoming a limitation. But by the time you've done that, also the GPU is a limitation, and it's not really a fun experience anyway. So there's a bit of a balance between academic exercise and real-world experience. However, we can clearly see that the 2GB card is doing worse, in fact, with modern games. Not really a huge surprise, but if you're still running a 960, you might be able to get a little bit further with a 4GB model today than you would with a 2GB model today, and still stretch it out just that much longer through games as they launch without needing an upgrade pathway. So anyway, that's the 2 versus 4GB. In 2019, there are differences. The image quality is the most interesting one, and also tells us a story about how in testing we need to pay attention to things like image quality and not just the numbers, because clearly some games resolve this differently than others, and that can invalidate test data altogether if not accounted for. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more or go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by picking up one of these shirts, which we've just restocked. It's the Blueprint shirt. I'll see you all next time.